many people are here are hungry, still hungry from breakfast this morning? Yeah. Would you guys like a banana? Yeah? Would you still want a banana? Right? Now, what's wrong with this banana? Nothing? Right? Some people, there's a little bit of feedback, by the way. I wouldn't eat this banana, okay? Because it's all brown, and it actually is not, actually it is a little damaged there. I was going to say it wasn't damaged, and usually if it's not like beaten up, it's actually still good. But some people may think this banana is worthless, right? It's kind of gross. But other people are like, that is the perfect banana, right? Do you have any people that say this is the perfect banana? You got one, two, right? Now there's other purposes for this banana, and I'm going to get into that in just a little bit, okay? But I actually wanted to get into the text. I'm doing 1 Thessalonians 5. It's verses 16, 17, and 18. They're actually really short verses, so it actually is almost like one verse rather than three different verses. And the verse goes, "Rejoice in all things, pray without ceasing, in all things give thanks, for this is the will of God for you in Christ Jesus." Now, this verse is really simple, right? There's not much to it. It's not like this deep verse where we're like, oh my goodness, I do not understand what Paul's saying here. But the practical application of being able to live this out is something that's really hard, right? And you may think, oh, well, it's not that hard for me to rejoice and be happy in God, or to give thanks in all things, or to pray without ceasing. I guess that's kind of hard, right? But the actual practicality, when life hits you hard, right, and when you're faced with difficulty, trial, tribulation, the last thing you want to do is rejoice. The last thing you want to do is pray sometimes. The last thing you want to do is give thanks. So this verse becomes really hard, rather than just a simple exhortation. And if you break down the verse, right, the very first part says, rejoice in all things. It says, pray without ceasing, and then it says, give thanks in all things. It's kind of like a sandwich, right? We have rejoice, we have thanksgiving, right? And then in the middle, pray without ceasing, okay? Now practically this is hard, right? Because we're always doing things. But the idea of pray without ceasing means that we're consistently praying, that we're fervent, right? That we're the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much, James says, right? So there's this tenacity when we're praying, that we're seeking God, that we're in communion. So when I see this idea of praying without ceasing, this means that we are seeking the face of God, that we're talking to God, that we're in communion with God, that we are abiding in Him, that we're hearing His voice, right? So then in the future, when I'm talking, I'm going to be saying things like fixing our eyes on Jesus or looking to Jesus. And this is kind of the idea of praying without ceasing, right? Because that's what prayer is. Prayer is a fellowship. It's communion. It's talking with God. It's listening to Him. It's also asking Him for things. So it's a, give and take. It's communication. It's work. And then the two other things, rejoicing and giving thanks, right? These are two kind of different ideas, right? Rejoicing means to have joy in all things. Which joy is different than happiness, right? Because happiness means like it's happening, right? So if things are good, right? If your sports team's winning, if life's good, you got your money from tax return, you're looking at your bank statement, and you're like, psh, that's happiness, right? That's not joy. Joy is the everlasting sense of just, it's not happiness. It's trusting in God, but it's just a sense of knowing that in the midst of all, God is Lord, and that we can be joyous. We can be not happy, but we can be just enjoying it, that we can rejoice, right? That we can look to God and be happy that He is in control, right? And then the idea of being thankful is that we are content with what God has given to us, right? That even in the midst of whatever we have, the little or the great, that we know that God is the one that's given to us. If it's nothing, then we know that, God is taking care of me. If it's a surplus of stuff, we know that, God is the one that's still taking care of me. I'm not the one that built this, and we're being thankful for what God has given to me. So that's kind of the breakdown of the verse. And the very last part is talking about, it's an explanation for this, right? The explanation, Paul's explaining, this is the will of God for you in Christ Jesus. Have any of you guys ever wondered what the will of God is for your life? Yeah? Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty common thing, right? And Paul puts it out pretty clearly, this is the will of God. But there's different ideas in the will of God. And rather than, I'm not going to go into a detailed explanation to explain this. I could have just ran with this. I was thinking about just running with the idea of breaking down how to find God's will in your life and all that. But I felt like just kind of getting the whole verse, all 3 verses would be better. But Paul's mainly saying this is God's desire for you, right? In this passage, particularly. Not that God doesn't have a particular will for you. I think sometimes, I know as a teenager, when I was first seeking God, right, I always wanted to find God's will for everything. And I'd wake up in the morning and I'd be like, okay, do I wear the red shirt or do I wear the blue shirt? And I'd sit there and be like, and then I'd be like, okay, I'm going to go with the blue one. God, is that really what you want? And I'd spend like 5 minutes literally praying, asking God like what to wear. And then that either got compounded when later it's like I'd be witnessing or talking to somebody and they're like, dude, that shirt really spoke to me, or that, whatever you did there, or whatever, like whatever choice that I made actually had some impact. And so then I had this idea that to follow God's will, it meant that I had to do everything in a cookie cutter fashion, right? So I was always seeking that right step. It's kind of like playing Guitar Hero or Rock Band. Have you guys done that before? I know I'm kind of young, but I still love games. And you have to hit everything at the right time, right? So it's like you have to have that precision. And sometimes I felt like at that time that God's will was like that I had to sit there and know exactly what God was wanting me to do. And I felt kind of constrained because I felt like sometimes I had messed up God's will, right? Because I hadn't listened hard enough, or I wasn't praying without ceasing, or I wasn't in tune with God. And I think that God works a lot different than that now, because I see God as completely sovereign, but yet also knowing who we are and working within our own personality and allowing us to fruitfully work with him in doing his will. So he has chosen us because of who we are, and he wants to work in us and through us. Paul, for example, right? We look at the New Testament, all these books. These books, you can tell, were not written in a cookie-cutter format, right? We have Paul wrote, John wrote, all the different New Testament authors. We have Luke, right? They all wrote their own style. Right? If God really if God really worked in the way where he wanted everything cookie cutter and exactly as precise with his own personality and his own stamp, the New Testament would look that way, right? It would look like it is exactly written by one person, but instead, God used each author to write in the way that he wanted to, right? To convey his truth. And that's the way that God uses us. And so we look at this verse, it's like, for this is the will of God, and Paul is basically saying is that God's intention and God's desires for you is to rejoice in all things, to pray without ceasing, to continually seek God's face, to be thankful, right? Because when we're following God's will, when we're following God's desire, that's what's best for us. Okay? So, back to this banana, right? Now, sometimes, like I said, we see these things as worthless, and what is one good purpose for this banana besides eating it? Banana bread. Yes. There's the old adage, if you have lemons, make lemonade, right? And the kind of idea is, just make the best out of things. But I think sometimes life doesn't seem like it's just like an ingredient that we can use, for something greater. It seems sometimes broken, right? And I think that's where I want to hit at, because I think there's this idea that when people go through difficulty or go through trial or even go through tragedy, right, that we can sit there and just kind of give them some simple assessment of, hey, all things work together for good, just kind of suck it up, right? That's kind of the idea, right? The Army term is suck it up. My wife, she's from the Army, right? So then we were talking about this, and I was just like, there's a lot of times where that's your attitude. It's just like, suck it up. It's like, oh, you burnt my bacon. And she's just like, suck it up, like, just take it, right? And it's like everything. It's like, it's like, oh, this hurts. I stubbed my toe. She's like, suck it up, And it's like, oh, I have appendicitis. I have to go to the hospital. And she's like, suck it up. And that actually did happen. Yeah, so, it's like, so sometimes, like, we don't mean to say that, but when somebody is facing something, and maybe we've gone through it, maybe we haven't gone through it, our general attitude or disposition is not compassion sometimes. Or even if we have compassion, sometimes our default answer is, hey, God's going to work it through. God's going to make something better. Like if life gives you lemons, make lemonade. If you have a bad banana, make banana bread, right? It's like, but those don't hit the truth of what it means to actually walk through something. And especially when I'm going through this, I want to make sure that you guys know that that's not my intent, right? My intent is not to sit there and put a Band-Aid over it and say, you know what, no matter what you're going through, this is the easy fix, right? Because I'm going to present something that this is the way to work through something, but I fully understand that it's a process, right? When you're going through tragedy, you don't just work. It's not like, oh, you can just hold on to one thing and one simple truth just kind of pushes you through, right? You have to hold on to something, right? It's a process, it's a work. It's something that God has to pull you through. And it may be 10 or 15 years until you're finally at the end where you can sit there and say, hey, you know what? God did pull me through. And by looking to Jesus, by fixing my eyes on him, I was able to hold on to the hope. So back with the banana though, that have you guys seen the white and black, or it's the gold and black dress and the blue and black dress thing on Facebook? How many people saw that? Yeah? Were you guys tricked? Were your eyes tricked? Did you see the wrong color? It was, I think, traditionally blue and black. I think that's what it's supposed to be. And then some people saw gold and white. Right? Right? And then the reason for this is because our brain perceives all of our senses, right? And then it interprets things, and it tries to make sense of things, and it based all what we've seen in the past and then makes assumptions on what things should look like in the future. It's actually really cool. They have this TV show called Brain Games, which I actually saw before. They had the whole dress thing, and they basically went through different experiments where your brain was interpreting different things. They had one experiment where a lady was saying, let's see here, it was she was saying ba, 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 but then they filmed her saying ga, 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 ga. And what they did is they took the audio of the ba, 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 and they put it on top of her saying ga, ga, ga. And you heard her say ga, ga, ga because you didn't see her lips move. So your brain, because it didn't see the lips move, thought that she wasn't saying a B, right? So then our brain interpreted things in a different way. So then you had to close your eyes, and as soon as you closed your eyes, you could hear the B, right? In terms of light, right, what we see, what we perceive is based on things like that dress is the light, right? Based on the things that are around us, okay? And if you have sunlight, it shows something completely different than if I were to show it black light, right? Black light, like when I did carpet cleaning, and a black light would show me where all the cat urine was, right? So what we do is we turn off all the lights and we go over there. But when I turn the lights on, the sun came in, you wouldn't see it at all, right? And so the light that we allow to reflect in our life and in our circumstances really determines what we see. If we let God's light come in and show and shine, we see something completely different. If we're going around with our black light, our negativity, right, not seeing things as God sees them, but seeing things as we want to see them in our own power, we're going to see all the P spots in our life, right? Just kind of a basic idea, right? So God sees things just like this banana, or things that are even worse, and he sees perfection, right? He sees a forest and a seed. He sees the end result. He sees what he wants to do. Sometimes we don't see that. And I think that the main idea that I have is just that when we look to Jesus, when we see him, when we're in fellowship and communion with him, when we're praying without ceasing, then what happens is that we are able to fully see things the way that he sees them. We're able to see the forest and the seed. We're able to see the banana bread and the banana, right? So we're able to see not in the black light, but in God's light, God's sun, right? That really shines things the way they really are. 1 Corinthians 1:27 states that, God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, right? And that means that God, he doesn't want to use us all the time in our strengths. A lot of times he uses us in our weakness. A lot of times he uses us in our trial. A lot of times he uses us in our tribulation. And a lot of times he uses us in our trial. And he wants to use us no matter what we're going through. So the main idea here, I think I have it up there, right, is that we must fix our eyes on Jesus, who is our hope. And holding on to that hope is really important. through trial and tragedy, because he is the one who will refine us, redeem us, and resurrect us in a way that we can rejoice and be thankful in all things. And those are the three ideas. Refining meaning that he's kind of working through us, right? Building us, redeeming us, that he's taking something that's nothing and making it something glorious, resurrecting us, taking something that's dead and bringing it to life. And that through that all, that we can basically, no matter what stage we are, whether we're going through a trial or we're going through a tragedy, that the only thing we can do is hold on to the hope that that is Jesus, right? That is the only advice that anybody could ever give to you, because that's the only thing that will help you make it through, is to hold on to that hope. Okay, so the very first point is refinement, right? Refining. So, what are all these things that Paul is talking about, right? He says, in all things rejoice, right? And maybe you think that Paul wasn't, I don't know, maybe he was just thinking about like minor tribulations, or nothing that's that big of a deal, right? So the question is, what kind of all things are incorporated in this rejoicing and being thankful, right? In all things. Romans 8:37, right, is another all things. Yet in all things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Have you guys ever heard that text before? Especially when you're going through something difficult, right? We are more than conquerors in all these things, right? What are all these things? Okay? Romans 8 is really cool. It's actually one of the best, I'd say one of the best chapters in the Bible, but that's my personal preference. It's definitely one of the best in Romans, and it's an awesome chapter. It is just full pack of theology and great things. But right before that, in verses 35 and 37, Paul writes this. He says, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are killed all day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter." And then Paul says, "Yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us." Right? So Paul, when he's saying all things in this particular context in Romans, he's talking about persecution, distress, nakedness, famine, right? The things that you wouldn't necessarily consider yourself a conqueror, right? You would consider yourself beat up, torn down, right? But yet, he says, yet in all these things, what you see as being torn down and destroyed and weak, you are a conqueror. Now, the truth is there in the scripture. And like I said, we can sometimes sit there and say, oh, when somebody's going through a difficult time, we can sit there and slap on a cliche, hey, all things work together for good, or you're more than a conqueror, just hold in there. And even though the verse has the truth, right, Paul was very specifically talking about a very hard time, him being beaten up, him being, just all the different trials that he went through the gospel. Paul is saying, in all these things, no matter what persecution we're faced with, no matter what persecution the Thessalonians were faced with, right, they were conquerors. And not only were they conquerors, but they were more than conquerors. Now, there was a fight that just went on fairly recently. And it was 34 seconds long. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Huh? Ronda Rousey, right? Okay. So basically, it's a UFC. Women's division, and the fight started, right? 34 seconds, right? And she knocks the other person out, okay? And that's pretty vicious. Now, she, in that state, is more than a conqueror, right? Now, have you guys seen Rocky? I say you've seen Rocky, there's like 6 of them now, going to be 7, right? So have you seen any of the Rockies? Yeah? Right? At the end of Rocky, right, what's Rocky's story? He's just beat up, right? He's like bloody. He's like, yo, Adrian, right? He's got like his face. He can't see out of his eye. He has to get cut open. I mean, depending on which one you're watching, right? He's not more than a conqueror, right? He may be a conqueror, right? But he got his butt kicked, right? Now this other fight, right? She's more than a conqueror, because at the end of the day, when it's 34 seconds, she just knocked her opponent down, and she won. And she's sitting there without any blood or anything. I mean, she may have had something, but it seemed like she didn't get scratched at all, right? It seemed like nothing happened to her, right? And that's what Paul's saying here, is that we are more than conquerors. We're not just conquerors. We're not just like the Rocky person with our face beat up, through these trials and tribulations, like saying, oh, well, I'm holding on to victory. No, we're more than conquerors. We're the person saying there, booyah, like, see that? I took care of you, right? Like, famine, nakedness, okay? Peril, sword. Okay, so there is a book, right, that I was recommended reading in my math class. And of course, because it's a math class, I like math, and I didn't want to read it. But it's called Flatlands. And it's a book about two-dimensional characters, right? And what they do is they live on two dimensions, and they like to interact with one-dimensional characters, right? This is kind of a two-dimension aspect. They like to interact with one-dimensional characters. And they like to try to explain to the one-dimensional characters that there's actually an extra dimension, the second dimension, and these one-dimensional characters aren't believing them. And then eventually, there's a sphere, there's a three-dimensional character is trying to explain to this two-dimensional character that there's an extra dimension, right? And then this two-dimensional character finally comes to the realization that there's actually even 4 or 5 or 6 dimensions, right? But I thought that was a really good illustration because I think sometimes, we only see things in one dimension, right? If you're a line, right, and you're only two-dimensional, all you see is what's on this piece of paper, right? You're not going to see anything over here. You're not going to see everything over there, right? And the idea would be is if you're going through, say, for example, a trial and tribulation, and you are on this side, right, then everything on the other side here, if you're right here, only seeing 2 dimensions, when this gets folded, when you have trials or tribulation, right, everything from here just goes away. Right? And you don't realize what's going on, right? And then what happens is that life comes back to normal, right? And you're like, oh, that's perfectly fine. Now I've got a little more character. This is kind of the idea of refinement, right? Is that God, He kind of works in us and through us, right? He kind of folds us. And there's a difference between what I would call refinement and tragedy, right? Because refinement is where we can see God working, right? That we kind of see the plan, we kind of see something going on. We may not understand it completely, but we have the ability to trust. Where tragedy is kind of something that hits us so hard that we can't see what God's doing at all. And we're left kind of wondering, what is God doing at all, okay? And we're going to get to that in a little bit. Right now I'm going to talk about refinement, right? And so as our life gets more and more folds, right, it starts showing more and more creases and more character. And sometimes we come to God and God shows us this, right? He's like, hey, there's something going on here. You got to see this, right? Even though you may not understand it, even though it's out of your peripheral, you can only see on the 2 dimension. God, I'm doing something here, right? I'm making something, and it's pretty easy to see from the outside perspective. It's not so easy to see when you're only 2-dimensional character, right? Let me see here. This shouldn't take all too long. But I think we're kind of used to that. We're used to, when we're going through something difficult, we kind of come to God, right? I know, like, for me, one of the times that I pray without ceasing, going back to that verse, is when I lose my keys, right? Because then I'm like, dear God, please help me find my keys. Or, dear God, please help me find my wallet. Or, please, God, please, I'm driving to the place where I left my wallet or something. I'm like, God, please, let it be found. Let me be able to find it, And I think God, He uses our trials and tribulations to draw us closer to Him and to allow us to see what He's really doing and who He really is, so that we're not so self-confident. And we kind of see that right here. See? Got a little more form there, right? God's doing a work in our lives. And I used to do these for evangelistic purposes. I would put a message inside there, and then I would have a little tag saying, open me. And I would give them to people, and they would open them, and then they'd be like, dude, it's only a verse. It's like, oh, that sucks. And I was like, sorry, It's like, you can have another one, Okay. So, in all the different trials and tribulations that God is folding our life, He's stretching us, He's making us something. That's how we grow, right? Is God, He pulls us, He stretches at us, right? This is the tribulation, this is the trials, these are the things that we go through on a regular basis where our attention comes off of ourselves and our own ambitions, and then we're basically brought back to the reality of, you know what, I'm not in control of this life. And then God makes something great, right? He takes what we don't like, what's uncomfortable, the folds in our life, and He makes it something great and makes it something grand. I'll leave it right there for you guys. And that's the perfect idea of refinement, right? And this is the message you guys have probably heard multiple times, right? That when you're going through something, that God will make it better, right? He'll make it better. He'll fix it. He'll make something glorious, right, out of your trials and tribulations. It's kind of a basic understanding. And how is that? Because what happens is when we're going through something that's trial, we all of a sudden turn our eyes on God, right? We fix our eyes on God, which is the solution, right? This is the solution to God making things glorious in our life. Now, if we were always fixing our eyes on Christ, praying without ceasing, we would always have our life be glorious, right? Because we would be in communion with God, we'd be abiding with God, we'd have fellowship with Him, we'd always be hearing His voice, and we'd be leading, and God would take everything in our life and make it something beautiful. And this is why we can rejoice, right? We come to God, and He gives us hope, which allows us to rejoice in all things, okay? So that we can feel like more than conquerors. Right? So our idea is that we fix our eyes on Jesus. We grab that hope that God can make something great out of nothing. And it's easy when it's just a fold, right? It's easy when it's just tribulation. It's easy when perhaps I'm struggling because I don't have enough money right now, or my car gets wrecked, right? Or somebody cuts me off in traffic. I think that's when, for me, it's like really hard when people cut in front of me. I'm just like, get out of the way. Like, not like in traffic, but it's like in a line, you know, like I've had that happen more than once. Like I'm in line waiting and somebody like cuts in front of me, like, what? I'm like right here, hello. Anyway, so the question then is, what happens? What happens when it's not just a mere tribulation, right? What happens when it's not just a trial? What happens when it's not just a stretching us? What happens when we feel so stretched that we feel broken? Right? What happens? And that's when we get to my next point is redemption, right? God redeeming us, okay? And I think this is really important because I think we've all been there, or maybe most of us have been there, if you've lived long enough, where something has happened that has just kind of gut hit you, right? It's been something that's so hard, or you're walking through depression, right? I've been there before, you know, where it's like nothing seems to make sense, right? I can't see any hope. I don't see what's going on. I don't want to wake up out of bed, right? And maybe it's just because of the way life is. Maybe it's because something tragic happens. Maybe you lose a friend. Two of the songs that we sung, How He Loves and It Is Well. It Is Well is the Bethel version of the traditional hymn, It Is Well, right? But that song was written by Horatio Spafford, who basically lost everything he had into a fire in Chicago, right? He was a lawyer, had tons of money. He lost everything. Right? So then he's like, hey, let me take my family and send them overseas, and then I'm going to start going to Europe. I'm going to build a new life, okay? Because I don't want to live in Chicago anymore. I want to build a new life, right? And he has 4 daughters, right? And on the way, shipwreck. His 4 daughters die, right? His wife is saved alone, okay? And as he's coming back on the ship, he sits there, and at the spot where he knows that his daughters died, he writes this poem, It Is Well. Right? Consoling himself in Christ. That's tragedy, right? That's beyond the tribulation. That's where you get gut punched. And you're like, there's either 2 options, right? We either seek the face of God or we run from God. And I don't know if you've been there or not, but like when we're going through just a tribulation, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to seek the face of God. That's not hard. But when it comes to a breaking part, right, a tragedy, it's like sometimes we just don't want to talk to God for two different reasons, right? One, we blame God, right? And we're like, how could you let this happen, God? I don't want to seek your face. I don't want to know you or anything. And there's lots of Christians or people that were Christians or whatever your theology is on that believed in God or professed to believe in God that basically were turned away from God and then are now atheists because of some tragedy that happened in their life. And they're like, God, they can't believe there's a God that allows this to happen, right? Or the other thing is that people feel so mad at God that they feel like God can't love them, which is the second song we sung, which is How He Loves, right? Which was written by John Mark McMillan, who had another tragedy, right? His friend died, and he was just very frustrated with God, very mad. And he's like, how could he let this happen? He was just feeling like just laying loose, right? Spewing all his feelings and frustrations at God. And then he felt, in a sense, condemned. He's like, how could God love me in this state that I am? And that's when he came to God. God gave him this revelation, and he wrote the song, How He Loves, right? He had a revelation of how God loves, that even in that state, even in that brokenness, God still loved him. So we have, different examples of people that when faced with tragedy, the question is what do they do? Where are we going to run to? can we move forward? Okay? So in the example of this, right, we're talking about refinement, right? What happens when what we thought was God's plan, we kind of see God's plan, kind of get destroyed and ripped apart, right? It was once beautiful, our life was kind of together, and it seems like nothing makes sense, right? Life kind of hits us hard. And I think, I know people that have been that way. I've been through that, okay? And not only is our life a mess, right? Then our life feels like it's drowning, right? I've been in that place. I was telling my wife a while back, I was like, I just feel like I'm drowning. I feel like I can't get up to get air. Like I'm trying my hardest. I'm trying to fix my eyes on Christ. I'm trying to move past my feelings, but it just seems like nothing's moving forward, And I know at times we can feel that way. And lastly, this is the cool part, guys. Our life seems like it's going in flames, right? You guys see that? I got hot pads underneath there. It should be good. All right? Okay. Now, the question is, how can we move forward, And the thing is that when it comes to tragedy, I could go through a list of whatever tragedies I've gone through, but it won't compare. Somebody else has gone through something worse, or somebody has gone through something different, okay? So I was like, well, what would be a good example, a baseline of that I could look to, right? And what is the general answer for any question in Sunday school or church? Jesus, right? Right? Isn't that like, okay. But I was like, that's pretty obvious because, one of my favorite verses in Hebrews, right? Hebrews 12:2, right? Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning his shame or despising his shame, and has sat down at the right hand of God. Okay? And I remember when I was in high school, I took public speaking classes because I don't like being in front of people. So I was like, I'm going to get over my fear of speaking in front of people. I'm going to take classes. And we got to speak on anything. And I was like, okay, I'm going to take this opportunity to speak about the death of Christ. Because at that point, we didn't have the passion of Christ, right? So it was all, just trying to explain it in conjuncture, the medical terms of what happened, right? And if you guys have seen the passion of Christ, you've kind of seen the brutality of it, right? And I went off and explaining everything that happened with Cad 9 Tails and how they beat him 39 times. And how it was one less than 40, because 40 was the official death limit. So they basically were like, we don't want to kill you twice because we can't legally. So we're going to bring it all the way to the point. And how they would use the shards of glass and things like that to basically rip his skin apart, and how the fact that he died on the cross before the other thieves meant that it was even more brutal than normal, because the Romans had perfected the process of the cross. They purposely designed it so that you'd hang on the cross and die as long as possible so that your friends could come and see you, so your family could come and see you and see what happened, the punishment, right? And that's why one of the reasons they beat him, because they wanted to just let out all their vengeance, right? They beat him and he was broken. And I remember just talking about that process. And one of the girls in the class, she was sitting there and she was on her hands and knees about to throw up. And I was like, oh my goodness. But the fact is that Jesus went through a lot during the cross. It really was a lot, And we look in Hebrews 12:2, and he says that looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, right? So he's sitting there being beaten up, right, hanging on the cross, looking at the joy, right? The joy of our redemption, the joy of God's will being made manifest, right? The redemption of mankind through his blood, right? Jesus is looking at that joy, which means that no matter what tragedy that we're going through, no matter what we're dealing with, and I'm not trying to minimize anything that people are going through, but the truth is that no matter what we're going through, Jesus took it on him, and he looked to the joy, and we can look to him in the same way, right? We can look in faith to him. So no matter what difficulty we're going through, no matter whether our life seems in ashes or beat up or nothing, right? We know, let me see if I get all this. We know that God can do something great, right? Jesus saw God as the Redeemer, right? That's the bulletin, right? Knowing that he would take something as horrific as the cross and making it glorious, right? And the idea is that whatever cross God has you on right now, or whatever cross you're going through, God can make it glorious. And I'm not trying to just throw this out there as like some cheap saying, okay, to band-aid some wound, okay? But the only way that we can work through any tragedy that we have is understanding that God is our hope, and that God will take, no matter what tragedy we're going through, that He will make it something glorious. That's the only way that we can work through it. So, going back to redemption, right? Redemption is the idea of taking something that has no value and making it something of more value, right? That's the traditional idea, right? Sometimes people go to garage sales, they'll buy something, they'll sand it down, then they'll resell it, right? The idea of redemption, taking something that's of no value to somebody else and making it something of more value. And God, He does that when He redeems us, but He takes that which is nothing and He returns it to a greater value than it was originally, right? He takes, through the process of whatever we're going through, He takes our nothingness, our brokenness, our ashes, our bad banana, our difficulty, and He makes it something even more glorious than the original thing, right? And if I can just get this, let's see here, open this back up here. Okay. Now, if you guys can see this, this is a beautiful crane that survived. It smells like ash, right? But it survived the ash, right? Okay. God can take our ash, He can take our nothingness, and He can make it something more glorious, right? And this is, it's colored and it looks cool and neat, rather than just the white folds, right? God takes the difficulty that we're going through, our brokenness, our emptiness, and He can make it something glorious. And that is the hope that we have to hold on to when we're going through something that's difficult. We have to look to that, look to Jesus, right? See Him as that Redeemer. Romans 8:11 says this, "But if the Spirit of Him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, He who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through His Spirit who dwells in you." Now, if you were just to take this verse out of context, right, you would think that maybe He's talking about the resurrection, right? That He's going to the glorification. When God comes back, He's going to resurrect our bodies, and we're going to have a new mortal body. He's going to bring life to our mortal body. But if you look at the actual context of Romans 8:11, right, once more in Romans 8, He's talking about our struggle in sin, right? He's talking about the battle that we face every day, fighting with sin, and even the consequences of sin. And He's saying that the Spirit of Christ lives inside of you, and it's not just, the Holy Spirit has the power of the resurrection, right? Here it is. "But if the Spirit of Him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, He who raised Christ from the dead will give life." Right? So God not only redeems things, He not only refines us, He not only redeems things, but He works in the power of resurrection. Right? Right? Bringing the dead to life. Bringing that which is nothing, that which is hopeless, that which is empty, making it something. Not just our trials and tribulations. There's no point to which we can fall or that we can go that God cannot redeem us. Right? There's not a single person that cannot be redeemed. I know sometimes that may seem hard to believe, that this person is beyond redemption, that this person has fallen, that this person doesn't, there's no way that this person can believe. And I think even Paul, people thought the same thing. When he's seen they're persecuting Christians, right, killing them. The other Christians at the time probably thought, you know what, Paul is the least likely candidate. And yet, what happened? God used that which was nothing to make it something that was glorious. And that's the same thing that God can do in our life. So, we can rejoice and be thankful in all things, because through it all, right, like the song that we just sung, or that was sung for the offering, through it all, we fix our eyes on Jesus and hold on to the hope that He brings life to that which is dead. Okay? We must fix our eyes on Jesus, back to our main idea, who is our hope through trial and tragedy, because He is the one who will refine us, redeem us, resurrect us. And in all that, we can rejoice and be thankful in all things. So my basic point is this, is that the prayer without ceasing, right, that we must fix our eyes on Jesus. We must hold our onto that hope. And that whether you're going through something now or you're going to go through something later in the future, the truth is that we must continue to hold on to that hope that Christ can take that which is dead and bring it to life. And He wants to. And that's what He does. That's who He is. So if the worship team come up.